Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Center for Data Innovation's panel for the discussions about the costs and benefits of end-to-end encryption and law enforcement access to user data. This panel is going to tackle the larger debate between encryption and protecting the rule of law and whether it's possible to do both. So basically, we're going to cover a lot of these new movement within this space. We've seen the US, EU, Australia, and the UK government officials call for changes to how consumers and businesses use encryption, arguing that warrant-proof encryption compromises law enforcement's ability to protect the public. So there's some questions I'd love to ask for us to answer this week. Can future legislation make it easier to find and prosecute bad actors and keep people safe without risking online safety? Is lawful access necessary and reasonable to protect public safety? And what should law enforcement access to user data look like in the future? Before we get started, I want to thank our all-star set of panelists. This is an incredibly complex issue, and I'm so grateful that they're willing to open up to us today and join us. So first, we've got Patrick Eddington. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Second, we've got Gabe Kapchuk, a research professor at Boston University. Jumana Musa, the Fourth Amendment Center Director for the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And Katie Noyes, the section chief for the Technology and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That one's a bit of a mouthful. I'm Kieran Uthi, a senior policy analyst for the Center for Data Innovation. We're a think tank studying the intersection of tech and public policy. We're also a part of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We're going to follow up our discussion today with a short Q&A. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. Please submit your questions through Slido, and I'll be happy to integrate these when possible. So I kind of want to start off the debate from a higher level 10,000-foot view of the debate. The first question I would love to ask, and I'm going to ask Katie first, and then I'll move on to a few of the other panelists. But what are the costs and benefits of end-to-end encryption and lawful access? Is there a balance to be had there?
Hey, yeah, thanks so much. And if you're okay with it, I just want to give just a quick introduction because I do want folks to have an understanding of the way the FBI is actually, kind of addressing this. So let me tell you just very quickly first, I'm actually the section chief of a brand new section. The new section has in it things like 5G and internet governance, our representation and standards development organizations. Really fun is that I have our patent program, and we in the FBI, if you didn't know, we actually are the proud owners of 20 patents. We have 10 more applications. And then of course I rounded out with the lawful access portfolio. I tell you this because there's a lot of interrelation, and I hope that our panel will sort of get here. But yeah, let's talk about this balance real quick. And let me do maybe right up front a little bit of myth busting because I'm really excited. I think that word balance comes up in a couple of different ways. I think it's the way that we're using it here between sort of, privacy and security, but there's other ways too. So first, you've probably all seen many of the quotes attributed to the FBI. Some of them go into things like that we're asking for a backdoor, we're asking for weakening security, weakening encryption. We just had a recent quote out there talking about how we're asking for lawful access by design. And I wanted a chance just to kind of set that up or tee it up. So first, the lawful access by design. Really what we're after there is, if you're someone who's been following cybersecurity for the last few years, you know that there's this really large move from a policy and from a development perspective to have security by design. So thought about and put into the design of the products. We're asking for the same thing. We have policies and laws that cover lawful access. What we're asking for is that those capability discussions are happening during the design phase and not as an afterthought once a product is, deployed. So that's really what that was necking at. Real quick, backdoor. Oh, this one's hard. If you go and Google the definition of a backdoor, you'll see things like secret, dishonest, surreptitious, like all these very negative pejorative words. In the FBI, the way we're coming at this is absolutely transparent. So happy to be with the panelists today out here in front on screen. Also making sure that we're using our lawful process as a judicial process. And then of course, strong oversight and accountability. So, again, that term I think just gets misunderstood and maybe misattributed to what we're actually looking for. And then, sort of the final thing on there is this weakening of security. Nothing could be further from what the FBI wants. We want strong security. We want strong encryption. But we're also very mindful that there is a balance to be had in all designs. There's nothing, there's no such thing as a zero risk architecture and technology. There's no such thing as perfect lawful access. These things don't exist. So what we're really looking for is a balanced approach to this conversation. So we see the conversation in two ways, and then Kerr, I promise I'm done. But so here's just another angle for that balance question. Two parts to the conversation. The first is on policy. We've had a lawful access really design, really since, you can go back to the Fourth Amendment if you want to, but there's always been sort of this balance on the policy side. So I think the first question is, what should this balance look like from a policy perspective? Part one. Part two is, if we agree there should be this balance by policy, then technology-wise, technically, how do we achieve that balance? Again, trying to account for things like strong cybersecurity and strong privacy. I'll stop there, but I do love that term balance. Thank you for the opening. And again, thanks for having me. And I'm really looking forward to discussing with the other panelists.
No, thank you. That was, I think the two sections on your balance are going to be things we're going to hit during this discussion. So I'm excited to talk about the tech and the policy side of this debate. I'm going to turn it over to Patrick, just because I think your position on the balance and also the costs and benefits of lawful access and end-to-end encryption might be a little bit on the other side. So Patrick, how do you see the costs and benefits of end-to-end encryption and lawful access?
Well, Kira, thanks for inviting me to be here today. And it's good to make some new friends and to see some old friends, especially Jumana. I would like to talk with you about Amir Mashal at some point in the not too distant future. So if we could do that. And if you're wondering what that's all about, that comes down to a particular case from many years ago, not directly related to encryption, but certainly related to our friends at the FBI and some of the tactics that they have engaged in. I think, it's really very simple when you kind of look at this entire proposition from a historical standpoint. Encryption is as American as apple pie. The founders used it before, during, and after the revolution. They were very well aware of essentially, if you want to use kind of a modern term, of cost-benefit analysis. And in constructing the Fourth Amendment, they had the opportunity to create essentially some kind of a carve-out for what Katie, I think, and a lot of her colleagues would really like to see, which is, in fact, a de facto backdoor. That is really what we're talking about. And, the founders made a decision not to do that. I think that was very telling. There was an opportunity to do that within the construct of the Constitution itself. They elected not to do it. In a more modern context, and I mean very modern at this point, dating from May of 1999, in fact, in the case of Bernstein versus Department of Justice et al. This is a case that was handled in the Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. And this is the famous source code is speech case. In essence, Dr. Bernstein, computer scientist, programmer, coder, was denied the ability, essentially, by both the Departments of State and Commerce to basically put his encryption out there for sale or other use. And they were basically trying to put it under the Munitions Act as a munition. And fortunately, the court correctly interpreted that as a direct breach of the First Amendment. So whenever we talk about any kind of, upfront design, whether it's from a hardware or a software standpoint, any attempt essentially to force an Apple, a Google, a Signal, any other hardware, software, or combined vendor to deliberately build defective products, and that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about building defective products, would be a violation of their First Amendment rights. I'll also say that I think there's probably a pretty good case to be made that the Woolley v. Maynard case from 1977, which answered the question of whether or not the government could require an individual to participate in the dissemination of an ideological message, and I believe the government's position on encryption is fundamentally an ideological one. Government can't do that. That also, I think, provides a very strong legal barrier to any kind of attempt to force an Apple or a Google to build a defective product. And finally, when we look at this whole issue of information technology systems, there are only two kinds of those systems on this planet: those that have been hacked and those that will be hacked. That's a reality. We have not. Oren Kerr at Stanford has famously said, "We haven't figured out how to make perfect code yet." I tend to doubt that we ever will. Maybe AI will solve that problem. If it does, we may not like the outcome. But in light of that fact, we're going to have to deal with the reality that any kind of compromise, essentially, to either the hardware or the software of the systems that we all use today, whether it's things like this, the computer that I'm working on right now, or anything else, it just guarantees that you're going to have a lot more destruction and a lot more death, quite frankly. Encryption is absolutely vital to folks in journalism, and particularly journalists who work overseas, journalists that are working with confidential sources whose governments might well retaliate against them, possibly even kill them if their cooperation, with a news organization was revealed. And that's just one of the many examples, that I could list for you here. But I think the notion that you can essentially build a system in which only the government will be able to access stuff in a particular set of circumstances involving an alleged or actual criminal enterprise is really, to be candid, a form of magical thinking. If we look at how our own government here in the United States has in so many circumstances itself been compromised. I worked for the federal government for almost 9 years as a CIA analyst, later on for 10 years on Capitol Hill as a House staffer. And I have received letters from the Department of Energy and the Office of Personnel Management about breaches that have compromised my personal information. And in a commercial context, I'm one of the unfortunate previous users of LastPass. And for those who may not, know that software, that's a password manager, right? Those things are supposed to be designed essentially to protect all these passwords that we use, or passphrases, or whatever. And it's just a perfect example of how, when you don't have perfect code, when you then turn around and inject deliberately imperfections into the system, you're guaranteeing that bad actors, folks outside of the FBI, outside of any U.S. government entity, are going to be able to get access to that data. And that's why, the cost of trying to go down this road is just too high. And then finally, I think I would be remiss if I didn't remind folks that our friends at the Bureau absolutely have the ability to crack phones with technologies like Cellebrite, Gray Key, manufactured by Grayshift, and so on and so forth. And I'd be willing to bet that there are things that Katie and her colleagues are working on that she will not be able to talk about today that are designed to do exactly what I'm talking about. Here's the point that I will concede, though. I don't have, any sympathy for FBI arguments on this in a domestic context. It's a little bit more complicated when we start talking about dealing with foreign terrorists that are utilizing this kind of technology. That's where it gets stickier. In many cases, the solution of our government has simply been to kill those people without any kind of due process, right? This is where the drone wars kind of come into this. General Michael Hayden, the former director of the NSA, has famously or infamously said, depending upon your perspective, that we kill people using metadata. So the idea that the U.S. government can't reach out and touch terrorists that are, employing encryption, that's just not true. They've demonstrated the ability to do that over and over and over again. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there isn't a price that comes with that, right? There are going to be some criminal acts that we're not going to be able to defeat if we maintain, the current system. That's a trade-off that we have made with every kind of technology that's come along, down the pipe. People misuse cars every day to kill other people. We don't ban the use of cars. People misuse firearms in this country every day. There are people that are trying to ban firearms, which I think is a terrible idea at the end of the day. But I think you get the point. There's just an awful lot of technology that we've come to rely upon that is routinely misused, right? But we don't end up banning that technology. We don't try to make it go away. And I think it would be a mistake to try to go down that road here. And I will yield the floor.
I think we're going to have a very lively debate after hearing the two of you speak. I'm really excited. I'm also going to kind of build off of what you said, Patrick, with 1A and 4A, because I think we've got another panelist who's incredibly talented at one specific version of that, 4A. So, Jumana, I would love to hear your thoughts as we integrate everyone into the discussion. We've heard the terms, we've heard a lot of terms right now, but we've heard Fourth Amendment and warrant-proof encryption at least once, I think on both, if my tally marks are correct, if not more for Fourth Amendment. Why do you think the Constitution plays such a critical role in this discussion?
Oh, thanks, Kira. And I just want to start by saying I do appreciate Katie for coming on from the FBI. So we're having these conversations together and not just sort of in separate places talking to, journalists or lawmakers or whoever we speak with. Before I get to the Fourth Amendment, I want to start actually with General Michael Hayden, who Patrick just referred to, and what he had to say, because I know it gets put on us that, we've said backdoors or we've said balance. This is actually what General Michael Hayden, former head of the NSA, said about end-to-end encryption. He said, "I actually think end-to-end encryption is good for America. I know encryption represents a particular challenge for the FBI, but on balance, I actually think it creates greater security for the American nation than the alternative, a backdoor." And that's the head of the NSA, right? That's someone who has access to more information than I can ever dream of in terms of the security threats that are posed to this country, right? He spent all his time every day, all day thinking about it. And so I just wanted to start there as we frame this conversation. This isn't just lefty liberals or criminal defense lawyers or libertarians, wanting to kick the can down the road or, not let the government do what it needs to do. This is security officials who have access to the most sensitive information about American security who are also saying this. So when it comes to the Fourth Amendment, this is where I always like to start when people talk about a warrant-proof issue. There's no such thing, okay? So I think one of the fundamental misunderstandings about a warrant is what it does. A warrant is when the government goes to a judge and says, we know this crime occurred. We have reason. Here's the reasons we believe that this person was involved. And here's the reasons we believe that if we search this place or this device or this thing, that we will find evidence of that crime. They have to make their case to say, this is why we think we will find evidence of a crime and why this person's, device or house or car, whatever it is, would contain that. And the judge says, okay, you've made your case. Here is the warrant. You are free to go and search. So you now have the legal authority to go and search for it. Right. And that is, if you go back to the founders, to keep people from just rifling through people's things, to keep law enforcement from rifling through people's things to find evidence of a crime. What a warrant does not do, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to find what you're looking for, number one, or that you're going to find it in a way that you can understand. There's nothing about a warrant that guarantees that, and it can't. Right. So maybe you have made your case that if you search this person's house, you're going to find evidence of this crime. And you search the house top to bottom, every drawer, under every cushion, and you find nothing. That's what happens. And so I just want to start with that fundamental premise. Nothing about a warrant ensures that you are going to find what you're looking for or find it in a way that you are able to understand. And so if you want to take it analog, if John and Jane Doe are involved in some criminal enterprise and they create the most fantastic code ever with signs and symbols and numbers and pictures, and the FBI gets a hold of all of it and they can't crack it, then they can't crack it. And that's the answer. I know that's not a comfortable answer. It's not the answer that solves a crime or that solves a crime in the way you want to. That does not mean that the government, A, has no other options, or B, has to have the right to get them to tell them how to decode that. It's just not how it works. And so that's, I think, the fundamental thing I wanted to start with. I think Patrick also made a good point when he talked about how often when it comes to devices, the government can actually get into them, and how often they say they can't get into them. And this is again not, I actually appreciate Katie being here so much, because now, you become the person on the panel that everyone points back to. But I'm not saying that Katie did this, to be clear, but the FBI did represent a Congress that they had over 7,800 phones that they could not get into. And when the reality was, it was more like 1,200 phones. And that's a pretty big misrepresentation. And that also does not sort of lead to confidence when it comes to the notion of whether or not the FBI needs some of these tools as much as they say they do. I understand that they would be useful. I understand that they would be convenient. That, again, does not make them constitutional or lawful at the end of the day. We, Upturn, an organization called Upturn, did do a report called Mass Extraction, where they just did FOIA. So this, again, is not a comprehensive study at all of law enforcement agencies. And they got responses from 44 law enforcement agencies. And this was now a couple years back, so between 2015 and 2019, and I will tell you these searches have increased year by year exponentially, there was at least 50,000 extractions from cell phones. And this was not any law enforcement from any major city, right? So none of the large cities actually responded. What that means is they're getting these phones. They may have end-to-end encryption on their messaging, but once you get into that phone, all the messaging is there, right? And so they're able to do it over and over and over again through these tools. And I will say for myself, I just read yesterday a New York Times article where they were talking about this, like, basically law enforcement tech bazaar, where they were just the most sort of fantastical things that you would think were in a movie of how they can listen to people, get into devices, track people, were all, on the market. And so the idea that somehow this is going to be stagnant, every time an Apple or a Samsung or whoever it is sort of ups their level of security, these devices figure out how to break that security. And then lastly, there's also just the analog ways that you get information in criminal cases. And I say this because for criminal defense lawyers, they see it all the time. So maybe you've arrested somebody, they're charging that person, they have their device, they can't get into their device. And they absolutely can't. Let's say that's the truth. But they know this person's been communicating with another person. And the government often goes to that other person and says, look, we'll make a deal with you. And if you give us the messages, turn over your device, testify, do all these things, we'll give you this many years, or you just time served, whatever it is. And they access it that way. So there's just so many other options that do not involve saying the government must be able to access devices, whether it's in the aftermath, like they tried to do in San Bernardino, we can talk about that case, or by design from the beginning, that will still accomplish their goals without compromising the security of people across the country. And I think the last thing I would want to point out is we are living in a time where lots of things are being criminalized that are highly personal, that are the kinds of things that people might want to message about in an encrypted way. So we're talking about reproductive health care. And I'm using that term broadly because it's not just abortion. I'm talking about reproductive health care. I'm talking about trans children who maybe want to talk to somebody about what's going on. I mean, when we're getting to the level of government intrusion where we just saw in Kansas, they want to be able to inspect children's genitals just to play sports, right? And that level of criminalization, that level of invasion. And so there are so many legitimate reasons that someone might want an encrypted way to message someone to say, this is what I think is going on with me. I need someone to talk to. I need to understand, what's happening or what are my options. And so every time you think about a tool that can be used by law enforcement, I think we have to think about it in the context of some of these state legislatures that are passing laws that could take that access and use it in some of the most, I guess in my terms, and this is not a legal term, but some of the most disgusting ways. And so that's where I'd like to leave it.
No, thank you for those remarks. I think there's a lot that I'm going to give back to Katie after I introduce Gabe, just because I think if we add another level to this dimension, it might go full circle. Gabe, I want to ask you a question about your research, because of the four panelists here, you have the most expertise in computers and all of the things we've just been talking about. We've been talking about code between three people now, and I think you can talk about code the best out of all of us here. A lot of this discussion has been about abuse and how to make sure we maximize privacy and maximize security while also minimizing the potential for abuse. Is it possible to create abuse-resistant law enforcement access? Could you tell us a little bit more about your research on that? And what properties, at bare minimum, are required if there is a balance between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much for having me here. And yeah, I will say it's really a cool space to be in, to both have representatives from the FBI, as well as technologists, as well as legal folks, all in the same conversation. And I think that these spaces have been few and far between, and have oftentimes made it difficult to actually make any convincing arguments anywhere in the conversation, because they're being kind of had past each other. And I know, particularly as a technologist, what our role in this conversation is oftentimes very confusing. Because on the one hand, we get requests to build something better, but what build something better means is unclear. And on the other hand, we play a role and say, okay, actually, the thing you're asking for is impossible to build. And that's a really tricky role to play. And so, I would like to kind of maybe unpack it a little bit to understand what's going on here. So, from my perspective, it doesn't particularly matter what access is called, whether it's called a backdoor or whether it's called lawful access. These are not terms that are meaningfully different to me as a technologist. For all I care, these are the front door. Everybody's going through. Everybody knows exactly where we're going through. The question is who has keys to that front door? That's really the question we need to be asking ourselves, right? Just to kind of give a high level before I go into some detail here, right? If the process to get the front keys to those doors, or sorry, the keys to that front door is a purely social process, I'm going to be pretty nervous, right? Because the reality is all the things that we've talked about before is that the scope of who gets access to the keys, under what circumstances they get access to the keys, is really, really complicated. And it's not something that I can meaningfully say anything about from a technical perspective, right? So, looking purely at the pieces of technology that we have today, I think I'm very proud for me and my community in the way that we've managed to build encrypted messaging tools and encrypted, hardware encryption and stuff like that, that actually does a good job of keeping people's privacy. And I think we've demonstrated, at least to some extent, that this is true. One, because there are asks to get it open, but two, because the price on a lot of the hacking tools that Joanna was talking about is relatively high, right? And that's actually, I think, a good sign. Because we're actually building things that I would like to be seen deployed for everybody at all the times. And I think the stakes that are involved here, Joanna did a really amazing job, articulating what they are, right? This is not like, just this small marginalized community needs access to encryption. No, we all need access to encryption, because the reality is, I don't know when my segment of the population is going to be suspect. I don't know whether it's going to happen in 5 years, 10 years, or 100 years. Right. And so when it comes to building a technological system, we don't do kind of average case analysis. We don't wonder about okay, what is the average FBI agent going to do with access to this? Right. We have to think about what is the worst case scenario that happens with my system. Right. And it's most of the average case might actually be something that we're largely comfortable with. Right. As a society. And ultimately, I don't care that much about that. We have to really think about the worst case. And I think Pat did a great job, right? Talking about this exactly. It's not so much when the keys are used by the FBI that really keeps me up at night all that much. Although I'll be honest, from my political self, it does give me some worries. But as a technologist, maybe that's not where I have my most concern. It's when the keys get, owned and hacked by the Russian government or the Chinese government, right? And we have no way of knowing that those keys were exfiltrated and those keys are used at a mass scale, right? Because the only protection on using those keys was that there was an appropriate warrant of some kind, and there was some kind of, judge involved and whatever, right? All these kind of social processes I'm kind of simplifying down, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if the actual key material can get stolen, if the actual key material can be abused by somebody within law enforcement who isn't following the rules, right? These are the kinds of scenarios that keep me up at night as a technologist, right? Because a key is a key, and that's the end of the day, that's all it is, right? It's a key. And you can put as many social processes in the way of getting to that key as you want. But if they can be circumvented by blackmail, if they can be circumvented by people not wanting to do the right thing at the end of the day, if they can be circumvented by paying people large amounts of money, that's not a very secure system, right? There are lots of governments out there that want to pay a lot of money to circumvent these social processes. And then our entire system just falls apart, right? So, I think one of the reasons why the technological community hasn't done such a great job of convincing anybody in the policy world that these kinds of arguments are very real is that oftentimes the asks of us are a little imprecise. And so I'll take a little while trying to unpack this, right? When we get a request in the technological community, as the FBI and certainly Director Wray has said kind of many, many times, varying different flavors of this, right? It's we want something, we believe in strong encryption, but we also believe in lawful access. And then that's kind of the end of the conversation. And technologists turn around and say, I don't know what this means, right? This is not sufficiently specified for me to even convince you that this is not real, right? This thing that Pat said before, right? This is magical thinking, right? Well, it is magical thinking as long as it stays incredibly high level, right? If nobody ever tells me, well, what do you want for accountability? What do you want for transparency, right? What kind of technical mechanisms in the actual mathematical properties of the system do you want that actually means that you can only do lawful access and not kind of general purpose access, or that those keys can't be used if they're hacked, right? If I don't know what I'm talking about, I can't actually make a convincing or a compelling technical argument that it's not possible, right? I largely think that the kinds of tools that the FBI has been asking for over the last 5-10 years tend to be in the category of magical thinking, right? And largely that's because there isn't really a specific kind of way that we could kind of implement something like lawful access in code, right? Lawful access in the mathematics of the system, right? If I actually knew what I was being asked for, I might be able to say, sit down and say, actually, no, I can convince you that that's not possible. I can write down a mathematical proof that says that it's not that I'm not teching hard enough, that I'm not innovative enough, right? I think, Director Wray of the FBI, he in a couple of his speeches, he says, I don't believe that it's not possible to have both strong encryption and lawful access, right? And his point to this is that we can do self-driving cars. I'm sorry. This is a complete categorical error. These things are not the same thing, right? I am talking about basic mathematical principles of the universe. And if I know specifically enough what the ask is, I can write down a proof and tell you, I can't do that for you, right? And so this is maybe a part of the conversation I think has been largely overlooked because it's lived largely in the in the policy sphere, and technologists have been sitting there on the side saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to do in this conversation. I don't have a voice where my expertise can really add something new. So, to that end, me and some of my colleagues a couple of years ago did spend some time trying to unpack what this might look like, not because we necessarily think that these kinds of backdoors, and I'm going to use that term because it's a term that's used in my community, and I think it's a relatively acceptable term. If you want to kind of switch backdoors for front doors, I'm cool with that. Do whatever you want. But we tried to think, okay, if somebody were to force me to deploy one of these things, could I even come up with a definition where it felt like there was some kind of limitations on its use that might give us some kind of confidence that, it's not just up to a single FBI agent who gets the keys and they're able to go and use it on whoever, or, the Russian government hacks, whoever's holding those keys and then starts using them out wild, right? What could we even come up with here that would be something good, right? And importantly, I want to really make a clear differentiation. This is like Gabe as technologist, not Gabe as somebody who wants to comment on a policy conversation, right? And I think they interplay and they go back and forth, but this is, purely technical. And, what we found is that we can come up with maybe interesting definitions, right? Maybe we can have some kind of definition that says every time this key gets used, we actually can bake into the mathematics of the system that everybody gets to learn that it was used for something, right? Not necessarily who it was used against or what it was used for, but we get maybe even just a counter, right? We know every time it's used, right? Something as basic as that might take a step towards some kinds of accountability. Maybe put it a different way, right? Maybe we only want these kinds of keys to be able to be used when the search was very, very narrow in scope, right? So we don't want something like a location-based warrant, right? Everybody who is in this area is now scoped into this search, right? Maybe that's too broad for our society. Maybe we want to say, no, you have to name a specific person, right? And only then maybe you can use the key, right? Okay, I can potentially build or I can give you a definition for that kind of system that says, this is how that might work, right? And so we spent some time trying to do this and trying to articulate maybe different kinds of trade-offs here. And then we actually went to go try and build the system. Turns out any real kind of thing that the FBI is largely asking for is technologically not feasible under our current techniques. And it's not feasible under our understandings of how cryptography works today. There might be a tremendous magical breakthrough in the next 50 years that would open that up. But I think that that's I'm very skeptical of that possibility. I think it's very unlikely to happen. It's not about throwing more money at the problem. We have some very good indications that this would go against kind of mathematical principles of the universe. But we can kind of start articulating what is the thing that we are talking about. And by articulating that, then we actually get to have a conversation that says, yes, this is possible. No, this is not possible, in a way that kind of moves the conversation forward. Because to be honest, we've been having this conversation for 10 years. More than 10 years, right? We had it in the 90s. The latest version of the conversation is in the last 10 years. It started about device encryption. It's now talking about stuff like WhatsApp and Signal and Facebook Messenger auto encrypting and stuff like that. It used to be talking about terrorism. Now it's talking about child abuse material, right? We're having the same conversation over and over and over again. And technologists have never been able to convince anybody that this conversation hasn't changed. We're having the same conversation over and over again. And I can't do anything different. Math hasn't changed in the last 10 years, right? It's just the same. And so, I guess maybe to sum up, I think one of the kind of weak points in the conversation is the imagination that technology is simply about innovation. It's really not always about that, right? Technology is a science, especially how we do in the cryptographic community. We give proofs, right? We do things thoroughly and we do things carefully, right? And so in doing so, right, when you ask me for something specific, I can actually tell you, no, I can't build that in a way that isn't just about, can I get more data? It's not just about, can I think harder, right? I can give a mathematical proof that I cannot build that thing for you, right? And that kind of angle into this conversation, I think, has been largely missing. And that's both, a failure on our part as a community for not engaging, but also a failure of asking for that from us. And I think that will be an important part of the conversation, hopefully going forward, so we can start to narrow in on exactly what are the breaking points in the conversation, and then actually talk about, what's very real from a technological perspective.
I'm gonna focus in on these breaking points, but I'm gonna focus in on them with Katie. All three of you have mentioned CSAM, terrorism in some respect. You've also mentioned accountability and transparency. These seem to be like the big hot topics of this debate right now. And our debate's focused on these in particular with all four of us now. Katie, I'd love to give you a chance to respond to all of what Pat and Joanna and Gabe have said, but I also would love to just focus on this larger question that I know might seem a little fuzzy. Is restricting end-to-end encryption actually in the best interest of your goals or in law enforcement's goals? Or is this, for these four big topics we're talking about accountability, transparency, and like how the issues and debate keeps changing, is it possible that that's just not the right option and these changes could send us into a worse place?
Great, thanks. And thank you all, too. It's really it's great to be able, I love the word unpack, Gabe, by the way. It's great to have this chance to unpack some of this, because I think there's also some key points missing from the conversation. So let me start with your conversation about what's in the technology possible. Gabe, I will admit, I read your paper on abuse-proof lawful access. I was really struck by the fact that you separated it into a prospective, potential solution, which seemed to be a little bit more, in the realm of the possible, less magic. And then your treatment of retrospective. Let me just say it right up front. This is what we're after. We're after just this conversation. And you're right. It's because we, seemingly we don't separate the two into the policy question. Should we, and what should the balance be? Part one, and part two, legitimately looking at a possible technical solution. I think you're absolutely right. We totally agree with you. There hasn't been a whole lot of attention, and I really took to heart, and I took it as a note. We need to also be very mindful, you're right, of what we're asking for. And to that end, let me just answer it. I think really what we're asking for just simply is modernization. So we do have legislation. We have the CALEA, the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act. It absolutely thought through this on how in telecommunications there would be a lawful access solution. By the way, it also does two very key things, let me say it. One is the access is through a service provider, not directly to a FBI agent. And again, that keeps being stated. So I want to make sure, at least in the context we're discussing today and the lawful access solutions we're talking about today, it would be the service provider, not direct from a law enforcement person. I think that's key. And then back to the modernization. CALEA was passed in 1994. So one of the challenges is there wasn't this thing of encrypted communications, there wasn't applications, and there wasn't a cloud. And so what we're asking for is a meaningful conversation around balancing. And Pat and Jumana, let me just say, the factors you're raising, all of them, valid issues that need to be factored against what we're also bringing to the table. And something, by the way, no one else in this conversation has raised, and I'd be very interested in hearing what you all would say to the victims. So there's sort of three parts here, but we feel in this debate only two parts get debated. And it's sort of the privacy side, which is humanized and given faces to and given cases to. And then it's sort of this thing, security, and it gets lumped into government. One key missing piece of this is the victims of these crimes, the same journalists who are actually being victimized through criminal acts by cybersecurity criminals, by other types of criminals. It's our investigative tool. That's one of the reason we're asking, is it's the only way many of these victims will ever see justice or will be able to stop the harms. And that's not only terrorism, it's white collar crime, it's cybersecurity, it's violent crimes against children, it's CSAM. And so, that's why we're so passionate about this, is we are really trying each day, when you investigate a case, there's a victim of that case. There's something that has occurred. And that's what the investigation is leading to. So I think kind of two things for me. One is the modernization. Really happy to, I think, take this home and come back to, okay, what did we negotiate in CALIA and what does modernization look like and what's in the realm of the possible? We are absolutely not absolutists on lawful access. We understand there's going to be trade space. We need to preserve strong security, preserve privacy. We absolutely believe, and again, all the factors, Pat and Jumana, that you raised, they're valid factors that need to get weighed in this debate. But the big thing for us is that we need to bring the victims into the conversation. Why are we doing this in the first place? And it's to seek justice, to investigate, to bring criminals to account. Please help us understand from your perspective, because some of you necked at it, you're comfortable allowing for some crime. How much crime are you comfortable with allowing? How many victims? How many mothers and parents sitting at kitchen tables, dealing with sextortion and those things? How many terrorists, Pat, you raised the terrorism. How many terrorist acts are you comfortable with having where there can't be this investigation? And I'm just trying to balance this argument. I love it. I would love to talk to more of, to you all more after this, but I just want to raise those two things. We are open to these conversations, but we do feel there needs to be a balance struck. And certainly, please help us understand the cost on the other side, because I can tell you, I've seen a lot of these panels, and that's the victim never really comes up in the conversation. We just really think that's our responsibility to bring that voice to the table. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So if I
sure.
could jump in there, I don't want to be unkind, but I think raising a straw man like that really does a disservice, overall to the entire debate. It's not a question of whether I or Jumana or anybody else, are concerned about or not concerned about, victims. Katie, what you expressed essentially is the overarching mentality of law enforcement. And it's not your fault, right? This is a societal problem, because the message that you and your colleagues, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level, you get this message every day. Get the bad guy, get the bad guy, get the bad guy, get the bad guy. The message that you don't get most of the time is protect people's rights, protect people's rights, protect people's rights. So in terms of the incentive structure that we have in law enforcement, it's all essentially geared, towards that, pursuit of the alleged or actual perpetrator. I think the other thing we have to understand here, and this is just based on DOJ's own stats, 50% of murders in this country go unsolved every year, right? Do I think that's a great stat? No. Would I like to see it, down into the single digits? Absolutely. Are you ever going to be able to completely shut it all down? Impossible. Some people are going to commit crimes. I don't care what you do. I don't care how many laws you pass. It's just not going to change. So this is not about us not caring about victims. We're perfectly well aware that is going to happen. But unfortunately, that's endemic to the human condition. What I think you're trying to argue is that you want a way to try to minimize that. You want to try to minimize the number of victims. So do we. We don't want to create new victims by creating backdoors that allow still more people to be victimized, right? I think that's the part of the conversation that I think really we ought to be focused on here, is that you're never going to eradicate crime. But does the Bureau have adequate tools, to address this? I could talk about that all day. I mean, it absolutely has an awful lot of tools. I've mentioned those. But I think if we engage in kind of straw man arguments here about, who cares more about what, that's really going to be very unproductive. Let me yield the floor to others.
Jumana, I'd love you to jump in.
Thank you. I would definitely like to follow on to what Patrick said, because I think the reality is, no matter, what perspective you approach this from, you never get to a point of zero crime. Just never happens, not in any society, not with any system. And so then the question is not, do you care about victims, right? Because I know, especially working for National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, it's like, we don't care about understand crime. I mean, I have had people very close to me, the victims of really violent, horrific crimes. That's not the point when it comes to this discussion, though, right? Because the idea that I know something really awful that's happened to someone that has affected me and their family and their community is not how you go about thinking about setting policy, right? When I became a lawyer, Just like when any FBI agent gets sworn in for duties, you swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. That is the oath that you take. And that's an important oath. And that oath is very much about what happens in the criminal legal system when somebody is arrested, charged, and prosecuted, right? Again, that doesn't mean that victims should just be left hanging and we don't care about them. What that means is that the Constitution is there to protect people from government overreach. That's what it's for. It is a restriction on what the government can do. And that's where the conversation needs to be had. Are these things constitutional? What do they mean in the constitutional sense? That does not, so the two conversations are very separate. And I feel like it's very much an emotional plea versus, the question of how we need to proceed, right? The conversations Gabe was having about whether or not you can actually build these tools. The conversation that I'm trying to have about what will people do with these tools? Because if we want to talk about the FBI, there's some real dark pieces of FBI history and present day activity, right? We know the FBI was infiltrating not just the Black Panthers, but the movement for Black Lives, right? In terms of putting, and putting in what they would call, undercover agents, what we call agent provocateurs. They've done it in the context of terrorism. They've done it in the context of protest movements. And when I say in the context of terrorism, like literally sending people into mosques to try and develop plots to pull people into. And sometimes so unartfully that the people in mosques have called the FBI to say, hey, there's this guy in our mosque who keeps trying to rile everybody up and set plots, and you should check this guy out. And it was the FBI's own informant, right? And so I think we cannot have this conversation outside of the context of government overreach and of FBI overreach. And I think the other thing that I want to say when I talk about places that are literally criminalizing trying to get gender affirming care, right, for people who seek it, I think we want to think about the fact that when these tools exist, we always start with a narrow lane of why we need them, right? After 9/11, we talked about needing fusion centers, where the FBI and other federal agencies were working with state and local agencies to put all their information together to fight terrorism. And in a very short period of time, they figured out there just wasn't enough terrorism to fight. So they quickly moved to what they called an all threats model, right? And so I understand the seriousness of the nature of whether you're talking about trafficking in children, if you're talking about terrorism, yes, all those things are serious crimes. At the same time, what they found in the mass extraction report is that at least 20% of the types of crimes that they were searching phones for, they were breaking into phones for, were drug-related crimes, and that they used it to investigate cases involving graffiti, shoplifting, marijuana possession, prostitution, vandalism, car crashes, parole violations, petty theft, public intoxication, and then drug-related offenses. And one of the instances they found in that report was, and this is directly from the report, officers looking for a juvenile who allegedly violated the terms of his electronic monitoring and found him after a short foot pursuit in which the youngster threw his phone to the ground, and the officers sought to search the phone for evidence of, quote, escape in the second degree, right? And so I just think it's important to understand that there are very serious crimes, there are victims of those serious crimes, but that should not dictate policy or how we treat everybody's constitutional rights, right? Which is the protection from government overreach. And so if someone told me that the government should have the passcode to every device I have, or should have a key to my door, or should have a key to my file cabinet, or should have the code to unlock my safe, I would say, no, absolutely not. That's ridiculous. I think most people would. I mean, even Katie is nodding her head. But you're basically saying the government should have that key to the device where all of those things exist. And I think that's where we need to focus the conversation.
Before we focus the conversation, I'm just going to add a little bit more of a technologist element into it, just because I think personally, when we're focusing on these conversations, it's also what happens after all of this with technological innovation. So Gabe, I'm going to turn it to you and kind of give a hypothetical just to talk about another facet of this. Is there a way that, say we do manage to get lawful access by design or some form of it, from a technologist perspective, are there other tools we should be worried about, like open source or harder to trace innovations or access problems now that would just worsen thanks to highly motivated bad actors? And are there any other pieces of this discussion you'd love to comment on?
Yeah, I guess I'll just quickly say I really appreciate the framing you put on that, Jumana, and I think that as I said before, like one of the things that we try to do as technologists is we try to deal with like the worst case scenario of the piece of technology, right? We want to investigate kind of the boundaries of the things that can happen to it. And you know, the kind of scope spread or scope creep of these kinds of tools is pretty much inevitable. And certainly would be the kind of thing that without, it's almost impossible to give an oversight. We've seen kind of the history of the United States law enforcement constantly go into this kind of overreach mode before it gets kind of smushed back down and goes back immediately to overreach again. So, you know, building any kind of tool like this, I would be concerned about for exactly those reasons. You know, I guess from a technological perspective here, I think my understanding of what the ask has been from law enforcement thus far has been, you know, can the large service providers please give us some way to get into, you know, encrypted messages or whatever, right? And this is a different ask for what it's worth than can we have no such thing as encryption in the United States? Right? Those are different conversations. Now, I am not super confident that if we allow the first, the second won't follow 20 years from now, right? That is a separate thing that is like worth bringing into the room. But if we're going to have the conversation about what we're having a conversation about right now, right, then there is a difference, right, between these two things. And we should be concerned about the second, right? You know, when we were kind of debating this issue as kind of technologists, we constantly like ran up against this wall where we design a system, right? And we'd say, okay, like, can we get this kind of property? And then we immediately all scratched our head and said, well, like, why wouldn't somebody just encrypt their messages on their own on the platform, right? Because when I'm sending a message and it's encrypted by the platform, I can encrypt my message again inside that platform in a way that is not kind of subject to whatever this kind of backdoor law enforcement access system is, right? The reality is the math is public. And as Pat brought up earlier, the US government really did try its best to regulate math, specifically like throughout the 80s and 90s. And you know what? They failed. They figured out that was an untenable position, that math exists. It's out there now. It was only even kind of a reasonable position at the time where the US really had a lead in this area. But turns out the rest of the world knows how to do cryptography now. It's too late, right? Everybody knows how to do strong encryption that can withstand nation state attackers, right? And so it's not the most, it's not a super internally consistent, right, position that we want to be sure we can get into these messages, but then it allows for folks who are super motivated to just go and use, you know, the open source version of AES that NIST has, you know, here's the specification for how you do encryption. That's on the internet. I have that downloaded, you know, just in case we get into a doomsday scenario, in case I need to re-implement, you know, like this is the world we live in. That kind of encryption exists. And, you know, I will say that my understanding of the problem and what the FBI is asking for, again, is somewhat more nuanced. They're not trying to go necessarily, you know, after those very, very highly motivated folks. They're trying to go after kind of the lazy, or maybe that's the wrong way to say it, but the criminals who are getting encryption just because they're not trying that hard, right? And it'd be easy to find them. I'm not sure that, you know, all those folks wouldn't move over, right? You look at Tor, it's not that hard to use Tor, right? People built the dark web and everybody can use it, right? You know, I teach about Tor in my class. All my students know how to stand up a hidden service and do all this kind of thing, right? So we've seen this constant, you know, every time we try to take down, you know, or there's one angle of attack, right? People just move to kind of a low effort, slightly more secure system. And I do think that that's almost certainly, you know, what's going to happen. Does that mean that there aren't going to be some percentage of the folks who are doing things that we societally feel are not good, who could, you know, be caught or investigated by the FBI? No, right? There's certainly some percentage of the people we would kind of increase the scope of what the FBI or any law enforcement organization would be able to do. I do think that this part of the conversation, though, is somewhat of a distraction, right? I think that largely, you know, what happens after you get lawful access in terms of people kind of getting security anyhow is not really the point. Right. I think we should be having the conversation on the merits of itself. Right. Let's think about the people who aren't going to be highly motivated and encrypt, you know, their data. This includes something like, you know, a trans kid who's 11, who's talking about, you know, their gender identity. Do they have to go learn how to go download a super secure app that has open source software? Like, that's not a reasonable threat model. Right. We want to be able to protect everybody. And so I think that we should have the conversation on the merits of lawful access for everybody instead of kind of punting to like, well, we could just encrypt and therefore it's not a good idea.
Yeah,
Hey,
no,
Gabe?
that makes total sense. Patrick, I know, wanted to talk a little bit about quantum encryption.
Yeah, no, thanks. No, I want to ask Gabe, number one, do you believe that quantum computing will be achievable? And you're kind of shaking your head, but let's engage in some magical thinking really quickly here. Let's just think for a moment that there is a quantum computing breakthrough and it becomes viable. and it becomes viable for the Department of Justice to get that capability. If that were to happen, if those events were to take place, would it render this entire conversation moot?
Yeah, so I'll say quickly, like I am not a quantum computing person at all. Like I'm a cryptographer, and folks within the cryptographic community do work in quantum crypto and post quantum crypto. I will say that the representation that quantum computing is going to be the end of encryption does not represent our best understanding of math at this point. That is kind of it's not quite fear mongering because it is going to be a problem, but it's not going to be like the end of encryption as we know it. NIST is currently in the process of standardizing new post-quantum algorithms. That is to say, quantum encryption algorithms and quantum signing algorithms that will be secure to the best of our knowledge against adversaries who have access to large quantum computers. And so we're working, to get ahead of this issue. I'm not personally concerned about the advent of quantum computing in this context. I think it'll largely not affect the conversation.
It also sounds like, if anything, it's just going to make this conversation more important. There's a few audience questions I'd love to get to, and I think both of them are probably going to be targeted at you, Katie. The first one is, if this is about upholding the Constitution, is it possible that we're creating a safe haven for criminals where the Constitution via legal process can't touch them? I'll give you a couple of minutes of space for that, and then I'll defer to Jumana, who is a constitutional expert.
Well, I was going to say, I may be misreading this, but I actually don't think this one's for me. I think it might actually be supporting the point of view, which is, look, if you have this absolute position and it's absolute, we will do nothing, reasonable to try to, find some way to balance privacy and security, then are you then creating a safe haven for criminals? I thought that's where that question was going. Have I misunderstood it? But I think it was trying to hit at that absolute position of, if we're saying there isn't going to be a balance and we aren't going to strive for both, right? And you're only going to say then all things at the cost of maintaining privacy, then I think then you have to grapple with, whether it's the victim side or it's the criminal side, you still have to grapple with what's the impact, whether it's intended, unintended, what will the impact be if we do live in that world also? I think we posit the world maybe the other way, but again, I'll defer to you on the interpretation, but I agree sort of what I think the premise of what the person's asking the question for, which is, yeah, if we're looking at a balance, the impact of, we've talked a lot about, because I think, the three of you you sound like you agree pretty closely on the policy side, which is great. But so we're positing one way. Now I think we do need to posit the other, what would this, lawless environment yield?
Jumana, I'd love for you to also answer this question.
Yeah, I think I love how we ended on lawless environment. Actually, no, constitutionality is not a lawless environment. It is an environment which ensures that the government is acting within the Constitution and within the law, right? It's there to prevent the government from the kind of overreach it engaged in before we had a Fourth Amendment and even while we have a Fourth Amendment, right? And it's the fundamental principles that say if you don't actually follow the rules of how you're supposed to engage, of how you're supposed to access information, of how you're supposed to investigate cases, and you just go rogue, we will kick that out of court and the person will go free. And the reason that is there is to give that incentive to ensure that law enforcement is going to follow the rules, right? Is going to not just go rummage through everybody's papers, everybody's homes, everybody's devices, just to find something, right? Because that was the state of the world before there was a Fourth Amendment. And I'm not saying there aren't Fourth Amendment violations. They happen all the time. And the remedy is, if you violate the Fourth Amendment in the course of investigating a case, that case gets thrown out of court. And so that's not on the Constitution. That's not protecting the criminals. That's law enforcement not following the rules. And when they don't follow the rules, then people will go free. And again, it's not a flaw of the Constitution, right? It's the beauty of the Constitution. Because if you don't follow the rules, you don't get to do the prosecution. And if you can't meet the burden, you don't get to deprive someone of their liberty and put them in jail. It's a critical component of any kind of functional democracy. Because otherwise you're going back to the Star Chamber, right? The idea that you just send someone to court, say they're guilty, put them in a cell, and don't worry about it. And that's not the society we want to live in. And so this isn't, just like a vague notion of privacy, like my personal privacy, because I want to send funny memes to my sister and nobody can see them, right? This is ensuring that people can do things like exercise their First Amendment rights, text somebody in another state to talk about their gender identity and what they're thinking about, text someone in another state trying to ask about medical care that they cannot access in their own state, and have that not be able to be just, accessed easily by the government, because it shouldn't be.
You know what, I do really kind of envy Katie and her colleagues in a lot of respects, because they get to do cool things like run a RICO case, take down an encryption company in Canada, and then repurpose that company into something called Anom, which the FBI then used as a dragnet. It was an encrypted service. They used it as a dragnet to go and nail a whole bunch of criminals. So, you know, hats off to you all at the FBI and DOJ for creativity on that one. That, you know, that to me, that stands up to legal scrutiny. Maybe Jumana would disagree, but if you can shut down a company, you know, legitimately and turn around and repurpose it and use it in that way, very creative. It also proves that the FBI can actually get at most of these criminals when they apply themselves.
We're going to go a little bit over by about 5 minutes, I think, but I'm going to add one question to this, and then we'll go to closing remarks. Does opening up backdoors to minimize victims actually facilitate the creation of additional victims? We've talked a lot about the LGBT youth and all of these smaller, more normal communities needing encryption, and I think that's another big facet of what I think this question is getting towards. Katie, I'll give it to you, also so you can kind of close your arguments as
Sure.
well.
Yeah. Again, that is not what we're asking for. Again, I just want to go back to that. And I know first, just one quick thing. I understand on the alternate methods argument and that there have been successes, and I appreciate the recognition of some of those. The challenge is that using those alternate methods is just not scalable. And it's also very inconsistent. And it's not timely in most cases. Even the famous San Bernardino, it wasn't timely. There's, you know, not an ability to react. And in the cases, we have real world cases and where, you know, children go missing, or terrorist plots where there's an attack and we'd have no way of knowing if there's follow on or if there are co-conspirators and things. And also keep in mind, we're not the only, you know, agency or entity that needs lawful access. We have state, local, and tribal entities also. And as one of the panelists, I think it was Gabe or even Pat, recognized, it's very, very expensive and again, inconsistent. So it's not a perfect tool. And also, I'm surprised actually to hear all of, you know, you all are raising very good things, I think, about you know, being able to audit and having strong oversight. And we are largely in favor of that and commit that to you. And so what we're after is that balanced approach, which is absolutely ensuring privacy. And if it hasn't come through, let me state it very plainly. We are absolutely about preserving, defending through constitutional, through law enforcement, through legal instruments and policy, preserving privacy. That's a mainstay of the mission. We also need to, again, on the way to protecting privacy is also providing justice to victims. That is also a responsibility to protecting privacy. So thank you for the conversation. I really do want to have follow-on conversations with all of you. I think this is very healthy discussion. I would be very interested, again, I'm just going to restate the question because I really just not sure we got there, and an hour is probably the reason. We just don't have enough time. I do really want to understand where your balance side is as well. So if it's not absolute privacy, meaning like if it's not an absolute position because you recognize we do need some law enforcement lawful access capability, I would love to hear more from like where do you think that balance can be struck? We're definitely willing, want to hear, want to engage. Gabe, want to engage more with you on what's in the realm of the technically possible. You know, if it can't be done today and in a certain way and can't be audited, I really appreciated that about your research, looking at this idea of abuse proof or a way to make sure we can audit and we have oversight. We're for that as well. And so I do want to end on that. We want to be your collaborators. We want to be your partners, but we really do feel there needs to be a balance struck here. And we're willing to engage in the conversation. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to focus on this balance perspective for the key takeaway. With regards to balance, what's the key takeaway on each of your POVs that the audience especially should be taking away from this conversation, as well as the other panelists? Gabe, I'll go with you first, and then I'll move onwards to Jumana and Patrick. If you guys could do that within like a half minute, just so we can end, that'd be lovely.
Great. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation. You know, I guess to end on balance is a tricky place as a technologist. You know, I think we largely want to try to have policy experts be the ones trying to navigate these balances, and technologists being able to back them up. Now, I will say I don't really wear fully either hat, so maybe I'll try to say a little bit, using maybe policy Gabe's brain, but I think that for me, one of the big things is that any process, any way to get to balance that involves purely social processes, where we don't kind of replicate or hard code whatever those balance metrics are into the mathematics of the system, is going to be unacceptable. It's going to, at the end of the day, be exploited. Keys are going to get stolen, and bad things are going to happen. Right? We need to, if we are going to, get to the place where we need to have a balance, it needs to be replicated in the mathematics itself. And that is like, I can't say that strong enough. And that's been like, I think, a missing part of the conversation, both in asks and in responses. I think, for me personally, I'm pretty skeptical of where the balance point is being asked for by law enforcement. I think it is, a little bit too much access, maybe not a little bit, maybe a lot too much access. I guess I'll leave it at that and let the kind of policy experts, try to articulate maybe a slightly better balance point.
No, thank you so much for the technologist perspective throughout this conversation. Jumana, what would be your key takeaway?
I would say for me, like some people have no chill. I have no balance when it comes to the Constitution, right? Like I'm a constitutional nerd. I love the Fourth Amendment. I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about it. And so I would say from my perspective, it's not a question of balance. It's the reality that we are living in an age where there is so much data out there that is gathered out. It's metadata, straight data, communications, digital communications, messaging, photos, everything that is out there that we don't have a grip on, we don't have good laws about. And it does not surprise me in the least that law enforcement wants access to it, because yes, it's a treasure trove. And yes, you could prove people guilty of a lot of things. We forget that we have thousands of criminal codes, right, that people can be found guilty of. And so with access to that kind of information, right, which is not something they could have even conceived of at the time that the Fourth Amendment was written, a lot of bad things can happen. A lot of abuses can happen. So this is not about not caring about victims. This is not about, is there balance? This is about the reality of the time we're living in, and how do we protect those fundamental constitutional provisions that actually keep us a functioning society where people do have privacy in their lives and the government doesn't have constant access to your information.
No, thank you so much. Constitutionality is such an interesting perspective. I don't hear so much living in London anymore. And then Patrick, could you take us away?
Well, Keir, my thanks to you and your colleagues at the Center for having us on. My special thanks to Katie for being willing to come on the panel. It's rare that we manage to get representatives of the U.S. government to come on to panels like this and actually have this kind of a discussion. I'd be happy to have you come over and be a panelist at Cato for our Cato Surveillance Week, the week of June 5th. So drop me a line if you're interested. I'm happy to work you into one of those panels. I agree with everything that Jumana said, and I would just offer this caution to Katie and her colleagues. The kind of system that I think you're looking for could be turned against you and your colleagues very, very easily. And I would just caution you to think about that. You and your colleagues could become victims of the very system that I think you're seeking to create. And I would hate to live in a world in which drug cartels have been able to get into the phones of FBI, DEA, HSI, other agents, and get details on their families, all that kind of stuff. So that would be my caution to you. It isn't, for me, of course, it's about the Fourth Amendment. Of course, it's about the Constitution. But I would just say, be super careful what you're asking for here, because I think it could get a lot of you and your colleagues killed. That I would just offer that caution and something for you to think about. Thanks.
That's an incredibly dark note to end on, but I wanted to thank everybody for being here. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I'm really regretting not making this much longer, because we could have easily talked about this for 2-3 hours. And I think all of us would have still been interested. Thank you so much to the audience for your questions, and for everyone for this really lively debate. I look forward to talking to all of you soon.